Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I want to have a look at this.
It is 10 o'clock in the morning, Eastern Time. A tanker loaded with Iranian crude oil is moving through one of the most important waterways on the planet. The captain receives a warning broadcast over the radio. U.S. naval forces are ordering the vessel to turn back. Not a drill, not a threat, an actual live enforced naval blockade, the first of its kind by the United States in decades. And just like that, the world changed. This is not a hypothetical scenario. This morning, the blockade officially began. And what you are about to hear is going to show you exactly why this single move could reshape the Iranian economy, reroute the global energy market, force China into an impossible position, and either push Iran toward the most consequential peace deal in a generation or drag the entire region into something far more dangerous. Subscribe to Dr. Elena Harris right now and enable notifications. Because in a situation this fluid, new developments are coming in by the hour, and you do not want to be the last to know. Let us start with exactly what happened this morning and what it actually means in practice. The U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, officially announced that as of 10 a.m. Eastern Time on April 14th, American forces began implementing a blockade of all maritime traffic entering and exiting Iranian ports. The statement was precise. The blockade applies impartially to vessels of all nations entering or departing Iranian ports and coastal areas, including all Iranian ports on the Arabian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. According to CENTCOM, however, U.S. forces will not impede freedom of navigation for vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz between non-Iranian ports. In other words, if your tanker is heading to Saudi Arabia, to Iraq, to the UAE, you are fine. If you are heading to Iran, you are turning around. Now, President Trump had initially framed this much more broadly. Speaking on Fox News just before the blockade was announced, Trump called it a complete blockade, all or none, he said, meaning no ship passes until Iran relents. CENTCOM's clarification narrowed that scope considerably. But make no mistake, the practical impact on Iran is still devastating. Here is why. Iran's economy is deeply, almost existentially dependent on sea trade. This is not hyperbole. The numbers make the argument on their own. On a daily basis, Iran exports approximately $270 million worth of goods. Out of that, around $140 million is crude oil. The rest, roughly $80 million per day, consists of non-oil products, petrochemicals, minerals, steel, metals. All of it moves through the sea. And then there is the import side. Last year, Iran imported approximately $58 billion in goods, around $160 million per day, covering everything from consumer products to the raw materials that keep Iranian factories running. Now, all of that is at risk. Let us run the numbers slowly, because this is where the severity of the situation becomes impossible to ignore. On the export side alone, Iran stands to lose roughly $8 billion every single month. That is not a rounding error. That is an economy-stopping figure. And on the import side, if raw materials stop coming in, Iranian factories run out of inputs. When that happens, production stops. When production stops, people lose jobs. And when people lose jobs in a country that is already sitting on years of accumulated economic frustration, things get dangerous for the regime. This brings us to something critically important that a lot of analysts are overlooking right now. The protests that shook Iran did not begin as calls for revolution. They began as economic protests. People were angry about mismanagement. They were angry about rising prices, about shortages, about a government that seemed indifferent to their suffering. Those economic protests escalated into something the regime barely survived, and only survived through brutal force. But the economic problems that ignited those protests never disappeared. They only got worse. And now, with this blockade, they are about to get dramatically, catastrophically worse. And here is the part that should terrify Iranian officials above everything else. Time is not on their side. Look at Iran's oil storage situation. Iran has roughly 50 to 60 million barrels of storage capacity across its oil depots. Right now, approximately 60% of that capacity is already used up. That leaves only around 20 million barrels of spare capacity. Iran is producing roughly 1.5 million barrels of crude oil every single day. Do the math. That means in approximately 2 weeks, Iran's spare storage capacity is completely full. At that point, Iranian oil companies will have no choice. They will be forced to shut down oil wells. And shutting down oil wells is not like flipping a switch back on. Each time you shut down a well, you permanently lose between 5 and 10% of its extraction capacity. That is money that is gone forever from a regime that is already desperately short of it. This is not just an economic crisis. This is a ticking clock, and the regime knows it. Let us now talk about how Iran is responding, because the response has been equal parts threatening and deeply ironic. Iran's military spokesperson declared that U.S. restrictions on vessels are illegal. Iran's Parliamentary National Security and Foreign Policy Commission called the blockade a bluff. Ibrahim Rezai, a spokesperson for that commission, wrote publicly that the move would be considered an act of war and warned that Iran may also reveal other cards that we have not yet used in this game. He told Trump to respect Iranians, accept your defeat, and do not demand at the negotiating table what you failed to achieve in war. Extraordinary language. But let us hold that up to the light for a moment. This is the same regime that spent months attacking civilian shipping from countries that had absolutely nothing to do with this conflict. A Thai-flagged civilian ship was attacked by the IRGC, Thailand, a country on the other side of the world. Iran was conducting what amounted to maritime extortion, charging vessels up to $2 million in transit fees just to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway that under international law belongs to everyone. As reported by NPR, citing a lawmaker on Iran's own Parliamentary Security Committee, those toll fees were very real, very significant, and legally indefensible. So when Iranian officials call the U.S. blockade an act of war and an illegal provocation, the only appropriate response is, look in a mirror. Iran's armed forces went further, calling the blockade outright piracy. The IRGC warned that any military vessels approaching the Strait of Hormuz will be considered a violation of the ceasefire and will be met with severe force, according to Iran's semi-official Fars news agency. Iran's acting defense minister announced the country's armed forces were on maximum combat alert. And yet, despite all of this fire-breathing, the ceasefire is technically still holding. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif confirmed on Monday that the ceasefire remained in place and that efforts were ongoing to reach a diplomatic solution. The dialogue has not collapsed entirely, not yet, but the pressure is building fast. Now, let us talk about what this blockade actually looks like in practice, because enforcing a naval blockade in one of the world's most congested and strategically sensitive waterways is not a simple operation. According to ship tracking data from Kepler, by early Monday morning, well before the blockade officially began, traffic through the Strait of Hormuz had already dropped sharply. Vessels were steering clear. One tanker registered in Comoros under the name Elpus, which had previously been sanctioned by the United States for involvement in the sale and transportation of Iranian petroleum, was identified passing through the strait after the blockade took effect. A Botswana-registered tanker called Austria reportedly turned around 41 minutes after Trump's deadline, changing its intended destination from Oman to the UAE. Another vessel, Rich Sterry, began broadcasting a drifting status off the coast of Keshem Island, apparently stalling and waiting to see what happens next, according to NBC News. As of this morning, 31 vessels had passed through the Strait of Hormuz in the prior 24 hours, compared to the much higher normal traffic volumes. Of those, 6 were carrying cargo, oil, chemical products, or liquefied petroleum gas. The rest were sailing light, or their load status was unknown. As reported by NBC News, legal experts are watching this closely. According to Todd Huntley, a retired Navy captain and director of Georgetown University's National Security Law Program, the legality of the blockade will hinge on how it is carried out. International law requires that any blockade be officially announced, enforced impartially against all nations, and that humanitarian aid, including food and medicine, must be allowed through. The U.S. appears to be aware of these requirements. CENTCOM issued formal notices to mariners prior to the blockade's start time. But as Andreas, a senior lecturer at King's College London School of Security Studies, told NBC News, this looks less like a clean historical blockade and more like a messy, high-risk interdiction regime, requiring U.S. naval forces to identify, track, hail, divert, and potentially board vessels, all while operating in one of the most crowded shipping lanes on Earth. The U.S. military assets positioned to enforce this blockade are substantial. According to CBS News, CENTCOM currently has the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier, 11 destroyers, and the USS Tripoli amphibious group operating in the Middle East. The USS Gerald Ford and additional destroyers are deployed in the Mediterranean. On Saturday, as reported by the New York Times, U.S. military vessels had already entered the strait to clear mines previously laid by the IRGC, a necessary precondition for any serious enforcement operation. According to Trump, speaking outside the Oval Office on Monday, their whole Navy is underwater. You know that 158 ships are gone. Their Navy is gone. Most of their mine droppers are gone. That is a staggering assessment of how degraded Iran's naval capability has become since the war began on February 28th. Whether or not every detail of that claim holds up, the strategic picture is clear. Iran's ability to directly contest the blockade militarily is severely limited. But Iran has other cards to play, and one of them involves a body of water that you need to understand right now. Iranian officials have begun explicitly threatening to escalate the conflict to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Some of you may already know this choke point, but for those who do not, the Bab el-Mandeb sits at the southern end of the Red Sea, connecting it to the Gulf of Aden. It is, in terms of global commerce, just as important as the Strait of Hormuz. A significant portion of the oil that once moved through Hormuz has been rerouted through the Red Sea and past the Bab el-Mandeb to reach Asian markets. And just north of the Red Sea sits the Suez Canal, the artery that connects Asian trade to European markets and vice versa. Any disruption at Bab el-Mandeb has global consequences, and Iran knows this. Iran's threat is not hypothetical. Iran controls the Houthis in Yemen. Last year, the Houthis launched an extended campaign of missile and drone attacks against commercial shipping in the Red Sea that lasted months before a combined air campaign pushed them back. They can do it again if Tehran orders them to. As one analyst put it in a live CNN broadcast speaking about this exact scenario, it's a major concern that the Iranians may try to use one of their largest proxies, the Houthis, to launch missiles or drones at vessels in the Red Sea. The healthy threat was already deterred once, but deterring it again while simultaneously enforcing a blockade in the Strait of Hormuz would stretch us and allied naval resources significantly. This is part of Iran's calculation. Make sure you are subscribed to Dr. Elena Harris and have your notifications turned on, because we are covering this story in real time and you are not going to want to miss the next update as Iran's economic clock ticks down and the diplomatic calculations continue to evolve. Hit that subscribe button right now. Now, here is the dimension of this story that most Western coverage is not paying enough attention to, and it could end up being the most important factor of all: China. Almost all of Iran's oil exports go to China. According to trade data, this accounts for roughly 11 to 13% of total Chinese oil imports. And if you factor in the shadow fleet arrangements that officially do not exist, but very clearly do, that number might be even higher. But here is where it gets truly extraordinary. China does not just depend on Iran for oil. China depends on the entire Gulf region, and the vast majority of that oil moves through the Strait of Hormuz.